Okay, in this video we're looking at AO3, the evaluation of biological explanations. Remember that you could get asked to write a 16 marker on just genetic explanations or just neural correlates, so you need to make sure that you've got enough AO3 to be flexible there. But as we progress through the course, we're going to be looking at psychological explanations and we're going to be looking at the interactionist approach. And both of those you could use to support or perhaps contradict biological explanations. And so bear in mind that we will encounter more evidence later on that will help you to write your AO3 for these essays. So the strengths that we're going to look at is evidence for genetic vulnerability, supporting the genetic explanations, and also support for the dopamine hypothesis, which is the neural correlate explanation. Limitations, we'll look at obviously the issues with relying on family studies for genetic evidence. We'll be looking at the role of glutamate rather than dopamine. We'll be looking at the correlation causation issues of neural correlates. And then, of course, as we progress and we learn about psychological explanations and the interactionist approach, you'll be able to use these as limitations as well. So, evidence for genetic vulnerability. Obviously, we looked at Gottman's research earlier, which provides us with strong evidence for genetic explanations of schizophrenia. So those family studies showed that the risk of schizophrenia increases with genetic similarity to a family member with schizophrenia. So for monozygotic twins who share 100% of their genes, and there's 48% concordance, in comparison to dizygotic twins, which showed 17% concordance. So this suggests that the greater the genetic similarity between you and a family member with schizophrenia, the greater risk for you developing the disorder. This obviously means that the disorder is at least partially inherited through the genes that are transmitted from parent to child. And this is further evidenced by adoption studies. Research by Tirinari we're going to look at the very end of this topic when we look at the interactionist approach. And this is a really interesting study for so many reasons. In this study, they had children of schizophrenic mothers who were adopted away. And so these children were born of mothers with schizophrenia, and then they were adopted into other families. And the children who were adopted into healthy families still had a heightened risk of developing the disorder, which suggests that when we remove the confounding variables of the environment, they are still at increased risk of developing schizophrenia. But, interestingly, they were at increased risk only when adopted into dysfunctional families. We'll look at this when we look at psychological explanations. So it seems like some interaction here between the environment, the family environment, and genes is a better stance. And so we need to consider that it is not just genetics, but also psychological and environmental factors that increase one person's risk. In any case, though, research by Gottman and Tirinari do suggest that individuals are more vulnerable to schizophrenia as a result of their genetic makeup. However, despite the fact that family studies do show clear evidence for genetic susceptibility, i.e. the greater the genetic similarity, the greater the risk of sharing the disorder, the genetic evidence is weak. Concordance rates for monozygotic twins who share 100% of their genes is not 100%. This suggests that there must be environmental factors. Likewise, we see higher concordance for dizygotic twins, who share 50% of their genes, than siblings, who also share 50% of their genes. Because obviously, those dizygotic twins are sharing more aspects of the environment than siblings who were born at different times. Again, suggesting clear evidence here that the environmental factors are also important in determining risk. Some of those other factors that we could look at could be biological factors. So there's been a lot of research into birth complications, looking at mothers' exposure to the flu while pregnant, for example. Smoking cannabis in the teenage years also increases one's risk. We can look at psychological explanations, particularly looking at the influence of childhood trauma. 67% of people with schizophrenia have reported at least one childhood trauma, compared to 38% in a matched control group. So this does suggest that environmental factors are also really important in determining susceptibility to schizophrenia. Genetic factors alone may not be able to explain schizophrenia sufficiently. So we maybe perhaps need to turn to the interactionist explanations and a diathesis stress model. We now move on to look at research support for the dopamine hypothesis. So this is evidence for neural correlates as an explanation for schizophrenia. So we're going to have a look at some drugs' effects here and how that can support dopamine. When we look at amphetamines, these are drugs which increase dopamine activity. And these drugs worsen symptoms in people with schizophrenia and can induce schizophrenia-like symptoms in people without. When we take drugs like antipsychotics, which reduce dopamine activity, they also reduce the intensity of symptoms. This suggests that dopamine is involved in the disorder. However, we must be really cautious here and not fall into the trap of the treatment etiology fallacy. The treatment etiology fallacy is basically the mistaken notion that treatment leads directly to cure. For example, if we have a headache and we take an aspirin, it works. It works and it removes the headache. But that doesn't mean that the headache was caused by the absence of aspirin. And we've got the same issue here. Just because drugs used to treat schizophrenia reduce dopamine activity, it doesn't necessarily mean that increased dopamine activity causes the disorder. This is a logical fallacy. However, there is other evidence to still suggest that dopamine is at least partially responsible for schizophrenia. For example, many of the candidate genes that were identified in Ripke's study earlier on act on the production of dopamine or on dopamine receptors. So this does suggest that dopamine is at least in some way involved in the symptoms of schizophrenia. However, this is somewhat outdated now. We've got more evidence suggesting that it is not strictly dopamine that is involved, but it is perhaps actually glutamate. When we look at postmortems of people with schizophrenia, we find increased levels of glutamate in several brain regions. And several of the candidate genes that Ripke identified are also involved in glutamate production. Glutamate and dopamine are somewhat related. So dopamine restricts the release of glutamate. If there is less glutamate, there is more dopamine. So actually, perhaps by focusing just on the role of dopamine, we're looking too far downstream. And perhaps we need to take a few steps back and think about the precursors and think about perhaps the origin of those high and low levels of dopamine in the brain. So the point here is that although there is strong evidence to suggest that dopamine is involved, there are also other neurotransmitters, and there are equally strong cases that can be put forward for the role of other neurotransmitters in schizophrenia. So perhaps we shouldn't be focusing too much on dopamine and looking at other explanations. And finally, we're going to look at the correlational nature of neural correlates. The clue sort of is in the name there. So here we've got another sort of fallacy. We need to really question, do enlarged ventricles cause the symptoms of schizophrenia, or do the symptoms of schizophrenia lead to ventricular enlargement? It's unclear the mechanisms that are involved here. In this research by Booz, they performed MRI scans on schizophrenics and their non-schizophrenic siblings, and they found decreased grey matter and cortical thinning in the schizophrenia group only. So if we think about what this means, it suggests that the brain tissue differences are an effect of having the disorder rather than due to genetic factors. If it was due to genetic factors that were inherited, we would expect to see this altered structure and functioning in their relatives as well, in the non-schizophrenic siblings, but we don't. This is unique to those who are suffering from schizophrenia, which suggests that actually it's an effect of having the disorder rather than due to some inherited characteristic. But one thing that we must keep in mind here is that this ventricular enlargement could be actually an effect of the antipsychotic medication. When we looked earlier and said that this ventricular enlargement seems to worsen over time, although it's present at first psychotic episode, it also worsens over time. We don't know whether this is because the disorder is degenerative and these changes are happening, or whether it's a response to that antipsychotic medication that is causing cortical thinning and ventricular enlargement. So that could be one explanation. Another could be early trauma. Here we've got a perhaps third variable. There is research suggesting that early childhood trauma, which leads to PTSD, can cause some of this ventricular enlargement and can cause some brain abnormalities and structural abnormalities that we see in people with schizophrenia. So this could be a third variable that could explain both schizophrenia and enlarged ventricles. And so we need to just remind ourselves that neural correlates is a correlation rather than any direct causation. We would need to do much more sophisticated longitudinal research to be able to determine that.